I'm going to give a quick history of the conservation and environmental movement. The timeline I'm going to use is going to depict several distinct phases with prominent disasters. The reason choosing that is these disasters catalyzed action. I'm going to talk about prominent people and the major concepts introduced during that period and identify some of the books and papers. So we'll start with a 100-year-long period from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, the conservation movement, and then talk about the environmental movement post-1950 to the present, divided into four shorter phases. For now, I'll talk about the conservation movement. And a couple of things that are important to talk about this is that it's a pastoral approach, remembering that majority of people in America and Europe were still living on farms, and there was often a religious overturn to their approach to conservation, having to do with the stewardship of the earth. It was a period in which park systems were created, originally in the U.S., and that spread to other places. The field of ecology was developed. It was an era when the wild places on Earth were being discovered, the North and South Poles, the jungles of Africa and South America, the tops of mountains, the depths of oceans. There were some large-scale species extinctions like the American bison, the passenger pigeons, the Steller sea cow, and there are also some large-scale environmental degradation, uh, particularly the soil erosion slash dust bowl, which I'll talk more about, deforestation, and pollution in the rivers. It was a period when the population of the world was being expanded into the most remote areas. So one of the luminary thought leaders in this era was Henry David Thoreau, a writer and naturalist who lived in the early part of the 19th century. And he published a really important book called On Walden Pond, which is his chronicle of living close to nature in this small cottage that he built by himself and along this little New England near Boston, this little pond. He also wrote a book about traipsing across the coast of Cape Cod. He had a good quote: "In wilderness is the preservation of the world." In the latter part of the 19th century, several important conservation organizations were formed. The first national park was created in 1872. People often think that it was Teddy Roosevelt who started the park systems, but in fact, this was signed into law by Congress and approved by President Ulysses S. Grant. And it wasn't until 1916 when the Park Service was actually signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson, that the Yellowstone and the other parks that were created during that time were networked into a National Park Service. Another important naturalist of the time was John James Audubon. He was born Jean-Jacques Audubon in what is now Haiti, immigrated to the U.S., ended up living in Kentucky and traveling throughout the country, and he made these beautiful color plates of birds of North America that was published into a book. In honor of his legacy, after he had died, the National Audubon Society was formed, one of the earliest conservation organizations. But the earliest conservation organization, uh, it was the Sierra Club, and that was created by John Muir. John Muir was a naturalist, spent a lot of his life, he's Scottish born, but spent most of his life in California. And here's a photo of him and then President Teddy Roosevelt at Yosemite National Park, and Teddy was so enamored with John Muir that, sort of on a lark, ended up uh, asking to be shown the true Yosemite. Went traipsing off into the backwoods and talked long into the night and became fast friends. So Teddy Roosevelt became very much a conservationist and was instrumental in preserving Yosemite and other parks. It was also a period of natural science exploration. There were a bunch of marine labs created around the world, and the first of that being in Naples by a German, Anton Dorn, who had set up shop in the southern coast of France near Nice, but eventually settled on Naples as a good place to have a marine lab. He had a public aquarium to help fund it, charged bench fees for a visiting scientist, models that are still in use today. And then shortly thereafter, the first U.S. Marine Lab was formed. The Marine Biological Lab was formed in 1888, and the progenitor of that, the fellow who started the Marine Biological Lab was Charles Whitman from the University of Chicago, but Louis Agassiz was actually really the progenitor, a Swiss-born geologist who described the influence of glaciers on landforms, immigrated to the U.S., and created a school out near Woods Hole, Cape Cod, where the Marine Biological Lab is located, on Penikese Island. And this little school that he had a sign, "Study Nature, Not Books," which still is in the Marine Biological Lab library. And then the first state lab, now every state in the country has at least one lab, and the first of that being the Chesapeake Biological Lab over on Solomon Island, with started by Reginald Truitt. And Truitt was originally a College Park faculty, but set up this lab, which is still in existence today. The field of ecology was developed during this era, and a German ecologist, Ernst Haeckel, defined the word. He said, "By ecology we mean the body of knowledge concerning the economy of nature," in 1872. And then an important society was formed. The Ecological Society of America was formed in 1916 by Victor Shelford. And Shelford was did his graduate work at the University of Chicago, moved to the University of Illinois for the rest of his career, and there he is depicted sitting on some sand dunes. He described succession, the succession along the Lake Michigan dunes into beech maple forest. And then a young scientist, Raymond Lindeman, was at the University of Minnesota, did a thesis on ecosystems, started a postdoc with G. Evelyn Hutchinson at Yale University, and was the first one to define an ecosystem, a system composed of physical, chemical, biological processes active within a single space-time unit of any magnitude that is the biotic community plus its abiotic environment. That was actually published after he had died suddenly due to some rare disease. There was a prominent ocean explorer named William Beebe who was a person who popularized scientific discovery, and he was associated with the New York Zoological Society. One of the famous things he did was invent the bathysphere, this small metal sphere where two men were lowered on the end of a cable down to the depths of the ocean, and I think Half Mile Down, the title of one of his books, describes, I think they were about 3,000 feet, and which is nothing compared to the total depths of the ocean, but at the time was the deepest anyone had gone. He actually transmitted live radio broadcast from down there, and also wrote these books and serialized in various magazines, and was a very active member of society in the New York City. Well, one of the prominent disasters of that conservation period era was the 1930s Dust Bowl, and this disaster was an ecological disaster where the farming practices combined with a series of drought years resulted in this large dust clouds being soil lifted up and blown around, and this created a mass migration of farmers. Were on these small farms in Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, etc. A lot of them migrated to California. John Steinbeck wrote about that migration in The Grapes of Wrath. Consequences of this ecological disaster were manifold. So the larger farm sizes, crop diversity increased, contour plowing became instituted. Various irrigation schemes and the great dams of the era were built to irrigate. Federal crop insurance was established. Regional economy was diversified, and the removal of various lands from production. So the result of this disaster was profound, and I think we'll see throughout history, large-scale disasters that receive a lot of public attention indeed bring about social change.